I literally talk to people all day long who are now in their Hamptons house, who also lived here, or in their Hudson Valley house.
Economics, as Larry Gatlin says, economics ain't rocket surgery.
And I say, you gotta come back. When are you coming back? We'll go to dinner. I'll buy you a drink. Come over, I'll cook. They're not coming back right now. And you know what else they're thinking? If I stay there, they pay a lower income tax.
And if you have two locations, A and B, you raise taxes in B and you lower them in A. Producers and manufacturers and people are going to move from B to A. This is what happens with economics. And I don't care whether you're tall, you're short, male, female, old, or young. That's economics. Incentives matter. Even socialists respond to incentives.
Hello, I'm Bret Baier. As we've seen throughout this series, when it comes to taxes, incentives matter. Taxes change human behavior, leading sometimes to outright revolt, and sometimes to more subtle forms of rebellion, like moving from a high-tax jurisdiction to one where you can keep more of what you earn. In the 21st century, and in the wake of a global pandemic, Americans are more mobile than ever. Government continues to grow, someone has to pay for it, and the taxman is ever at the ready. But it's not a new problem. Just ask the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, or any other British rock band from the 1960s. As George Harrison so eloquently put it, let me tell you how it will be. There's one for you, 19 for me, 'cause I'm the taxman. Yeah, I'm the taxman.
There are rumors around that this is Britain's revenge for the Boston Tea Party.
Relocating to avoid taxes is, of course, as old as taxation itself. Individuals, businesses, and even rock and roll bands have moved operations just to get away from the taxman.
You've got fame and fortune. If ever all this disappeared overnight and you were left with one thing you'd like to hang on to, what would that be?
No money.
In the 1960s and 70s, Britain's high taxes were enough to drive some of their most successful bands, like the Rolling Stones, to leave the country for more tax-friendly places. The Stones famously went to France to record Exile on Main Street.
We didn't have any money. When I say no money, nothing. We had to get out of the country to pay the tax incurred for me. That's why I had to leave. Simple. Mick Jagger.
Well, Keith Richards talked about taxation in the 1970s in England as the ultimate price placed at work. As he very clearly put it, they thought that we wouldn't leave, but ultimately we did. The top tax rate on income was 83%. The rate on capital gains, what they called unearned income, was 98%. The Rolling Stones looked at the 83 and 98% rates and they said, there's no way we are going to work to give all of our production to someone else. And so they moved to the south of France and made the greatest album that they ever made, Exile on Main Street. What's fascinating about this is the rich, like the Rolling Stones, they are very mobile in their pursuit of where they're going to produce. But the typical person, the typical producer, the typical worker in a studio, they're not so mobile. So whenever you put a high tax rate on the rich, what you're really doing is putting a bullseye on those who aren't. The lesson for that of government is that if you seek a high rate of taxation, you will not get a high rate of tax revenues. Because anytime you raise the price or penalty on work too much, those who are productive, those who are producing wealth, will move their talents elsewhere. The most crucial aspect or driver of economic growth is people. If you ever try to take too much of what they're producing, they will go elsewhere.
Before he became president, Donald Trump knew that taxes affect decisions, even his own.
You haven't left.
I haven't left yet.
Are you going to leave?
Big story if I leave, I guess. If I leave New York, that's a big story. Look, the rich people are going to leave, and other people are going to leave. You're going to end up with lots of people that don't produce, and then that's the spiral. That's the end.
Appreciate everybody being here, cabinet meeting.
In November 2017, President Trump announced new tax cuts, the first major tax reform since Reagan.
People are starting to see how great this historic victory was. The passage of the massive tax cuts and reform. It's a lot of reform in there.
One major change in tax law was that the federal deduction for state and local taxes was capped at $10,000 with predictable results.
Sales of mansions in South Florida are surging as disgruntled taxpayers of high-tax states like New York and California that continue to move to low-tax Florida.
We've had the Trump tax cut now since 2017, and it seems pretty clear that people are leaving places like California and New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania, high-income people, to lower tax environments because they can't deduct their taxes anymore from the federal return. That phenomenon is showing no sign of abating.
We already send more to the federal government than we get back than any state in the United States of America.
The same incentives that drove rock stars out of England in the 1960s and 70s are at work today within the United States, and some governors are not happy about it.
The 12 states that get penalized by this law, all Democratic states, all states that Trump lost. Maybe that's a great coincidence, but I don't believe it was that great a coincidence. It gives all 38 states an economic advantage over us because they don't have this issue. And I'm afraid you'll start to see people leave New York to go to these 38 other states.
The idea that capping the deductible state and local taxes was driving people to live in different states, count me indifferent. What they're saying is we're not providing a high-value package in our state. You know, that unless we can allow them to deduct their taxes, the cost is too high for what they're getting. Well, I know how to fix that. Give them better service.
Blue state governors oppose the state and local tax deduction rescission because this was funding their governments. I mean, they could make sure they had high taxes knowing that the federal government would bail them out with a tax credit. It's a nasty little game, and President Trump called them on it in 2017. And now you see states like Illinois and Hawaii saying we need to raise taxes because we're not harvesting as much given the lack of deductibility at the federal level.
We can raise the capital gains tax.
So billionaire hedge fund managers stop paying a lower percentage than middle-class workers.
From Connecticut to California, from Arizona to Illinois, initiatives have been put on the ballot to raise state taxes, in spite of the fact that taxpayers leave those states in ever-increasing numbers.
We've tried budgets that favor the wealthy.
That has only led to more deficits.
Connecticut is not one race,
one gender, one tax bracket.
Let's start having a budget that works for all of us.
In 2016, even before the changes in the tax law, 600,000 people with a collective income of $33 billion moved from the 25 highest tax states to the 25 lowest. All but one of the high tax states lost population, while 17 out of the 25 low tax states gained.
If you're not a billionaire, why are you taxed like one? New tax money has got to come from somewhere, so why not from the people with the most? Vote yes on the graduated income tax to raise taxes on the top 3%. Generate almost $3 billion a year and protect your retirement income. That's the fair way to fix this.
But if you look at the 11 states that have introduced the income tax in the United States since 1960, in 1961 it was West Virginia, in 1991 the last one was Connecticut, and you've got states like Maine, like Rhode Island, like New Jersey, like Connecticut, obviously, like Pennsylvania, like Ohio, like Indiana, like Michigan, like Illinois, like Nebraska. If you take all those states, every single one of those 11 states declined relative to the rest of the nation in population, growth. They're right at the very bottom performers. The biggest mistakes those states made were putting in an income tax that destroyed their prosperity. And you ask, what benefits did they get? Better public services? No. Their public services did not improve at all. Education didn't, which is over 50% of state and local government spending is on education. And the education for these states did not improve relative to what it was prior to them putting the income tax. So they got nothing for it and they destroyed their economy.
People to the internet per day.
And it's not just people moving state to state. Some are willing to go even further.
Southeast Asia and India are truly mobile-first environments. If you look,
Eduardo Saverin is one of the co-founders of Facebook, with a net worth of about $13 billion. He renounced his U.S. citizenship in 2011 and moved to Singapore, thereby avoiding some $700 million in capital gains taxes. To some, that makes him a villain.
Now, I believe the vast majority of Americans of all parties and persuasions think that renouncing citizenship in America to avoid taxes is troubling, unwarranted, ungrateful. It is upsetting, to say the least, that when a person who has benefited so thoroughly from being an American, a person who accessed and enjoyed so many exceptional aspects of American society, just takes the money and runs, rather than doing the right thing and repaying a debt to a nation that nurtured, facilitated, and cheered his success.
To others, Saverin's actions are not only a cautionary example of tax avoidance, but actually play a positive role by limiting what government can do.
Well, Eduardo Saverin renounced his citizenship to avoid a huge tax on his wealth related to Facebook. And we should call him a hero for doing that. There's this view out there that somehow we're made better off when those who are rich pay more in taxes, or if they would voluntarily pay more. No, we're much worse off, because what happens when the rich pay more than they should is that Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and Kevin McCarthy have more control over the economy's resources. Congress doesn't just take in our dollars and stare lovingly at them. Every dollar that Congress takes in is an extra dollar of control that politicians have over the economy. And so those who avoid taxes are helping us all. A tax on a rich man is a tax on everyone, because it empowers government as the allocator of resources rather than real people in the private sector.
I will raise taxes for anybody making over $400,000. Let me tell you why I'm going to do it. It's about time they start paying a fair share of the economic responsibility we have.
We can fix all of these problems, every one of them.
Joe Biden ran on a platform that called for tax hikes on both individuals and corporations. With control of the White House and both chambers of Congress, Democrats now seem poised to carry through on at least some of Biden's election year promises.
The very wealthy should pay a fair share. Corporations should pay a fair share.
The argument is always that the affluent should pay their fair share. And no one can define fair, since that's in the eye of the beholder. So if I answer the question, I think they pay their fair share. The top 5% pay over 50% of the income taxes, the top 1% disproportionately, and they, in the process, finance all of the core functions of government that we pass bills about every year. And then we have other taxes, payroll taxes, which have become increasingly important, but those are dedicated to Social Security, Medicare, things like that. And so if you just look at the general functions of government, we've got the top 5% of Americans paying for all of that. Is that right? Is that fair?
In 2017, the top 5% of American earners paid almost 60% of all income taxes. The bottom 50% of American earners, just 3%.
What a lot of people do not understand, and I would include about 99% of members of Congress, we have one of the most progressive income tax systems in the world. The rich in America pay a greater share of the income tax burden than do their counterparts in any other industrialized country. The poor in America have the lightest income tax burden than do the poor in any other industrialized country.
As the tax burden falls on fewer and fewer Americans at the top of the income scale, resistance to higher federal income taxes has diminished. As a result, The political penalty for a pledge to increase the income tax has fallen as well.
We've come to a time in America where there's a lot of get even with them-ism. There's a lot of desire on the part of people who don't think that they are particularly rich to get even with those people in Silicon Valley or get even those bond traders.
How many of you did really well with that $1.9 trillion tax cut that increased? Really good shape, right? Really changed your, well, you did. Well, that's good. I'm glad to see you're doing well already. And I'm good. But guess what? If you elect me, you're not going to have your taxes are going to be raised, not cut.
And so the notion you're going to raise taxes on them, that's no longer a disqualifying characteristic because it's not going to affect me, it's going to affect them. And Biden was honest enough to say we're not doing this to raise revenue. He wasn't talking about lowering the national debt when he did this. He's saying so that we can pay for all of these progressive programs from the Green New Deal to other things. Well, what are those? That's social justice. This is basically saying we're going to raise taxes on this group so as to affect change for people over here. It's the epitome of using the tax system for social change rather than to pay your bills.
According to an analysis by the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, Biden's proposals would raise about $3.3 trillion over the next 10 years. But they would also shrink the gross domestic product by 1.6%. And they would cost the economy more than 500,000 jobs, resulting in a 2% average decline in after-tax income for all taxpayers.
So there are a whole set of proposals for raising taxes, and they include raising the top rate, taxing dividends and capital gains as ordinary income, so not a preferential rates, raising the corporate rate, raising the de facto estate tax, just everything going up, heavy emphasis on taxing the affluent and taxing the things that cause the economy to grow, the work, return to capital, the kinds of things that you get from saving and investment. I can't think of one good thing to say about those proposals. They're in and of themselves a bad idea at a really bad time. We're coming out of a terrible downturn, and I don't think they have any merit.
The Biden plan is the Obama plan with wasting more money. It's a tax increase and a spending program. When we did that under Obama, we had the lousiest recovery, the weakest recovery in modern history since World War II. Spending money is not sustainable. Growth, jobs, production, that's sustainable.
There's no way that you can get away with funding the massive increase of spending that he says he wants just by taxing higher income people. It's delusional.
Hey everybody, we're back here with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Some in the Democratic Party want to go even further.
Now, Congresswoman, you have proposed a 70% tax on rich folks. Now,
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been very aggressively advocating broad sweeping returns to the 70% or 91% income tax rates of the 1950s and 60s, but without all the loopholes in place.
You know, people are yelling, you know, she's a socialist, she wants 70% marginal tax rates. Under Republican administration, Dwight Eisenhower, we had 90% marginal tax rates.
Wow.
This is an attempt to repurpose tax history for modern day political messages. There are talking points. Almost nobody in that era is actually paying full price on their taxes. The reason being is during the 1940s and 1950s, as the revenue codes are being enacted with these high rates, Congress built in all sorts of loopholes, exemptions, deductions, and shelters. Some of the more infamous ones being there were actually companies that would offer a cruise ship vacation to the Hawaiian Islands, and as long as you were sitting on board the cruise ship and you attended like a 1-hour real estate seminar, you could deduct the entire vacation as a business expense. There were all sorts of real estate categories that allowed secondary and tertiary streams of income to be taxed or sheltered at favorable rates. And what this meant is if you were wealthy, And you could hire a top-end accountant, you could hire lawyers that knew how to navigate the tax code. You could reduce your burden from this really high rate on paper, 80 or 90%, down to something that was much more realistic.
Yeah. But I want to point out that she's a socialist, she wants 7% tax rates. Those are both accurate, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay.
Democratic, though.
Democratic socialist. Democratic socialist.
Very different.
Okay.
Very different.
Well, thank you.
Today, the U.S. government is running the highest deficits as a percentage of GDP since the Second World War. Even before the pandemic, the deficit was nearly $1 trillion per year. And this year, it will nearly quadruple to almost $4 trillion.
I hope they don't raise your taxes. But if they do, I told you so.
At the end of the day, two things are true. Government always comes out of crises larger, and taxes inevitably go up to pay for it. We're seeing the exact same thing today with the coronavirus crisis. I'm convinced that we will come out of that with bigger government and a massive tax increase to pay for it, or at a minimum to pay off the debts that were incurred in order to try to prop up the economy.
And so, as Americans live through yet another crisis, government seems poised once again to react by expanding its control of the economy and taking a bite into what the founders called each citizen's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Will these new steps inspire a new tax rebellion? And if so, what form will it take?
I do not think we will ever get back to the founders' nirvana. And we won't, because arguably one of the tragedies of prosperity, and it's still a trade-off you'd make, is that, again, politicians arrogate to themselves a percentage of the production of the most productive people on earth. People aren't going to basically try to overturn all of this so that they can limit what flows to government. There's so much prosperity now that people are willing, sadly, I think, to hand over a percentage of their income to politicians. And as long as they do, politicians will forever discover new and inventive ways to spend the wealth that we produce.
Tax evasion and tax avoidance is as old as the process of taxation itself. This is a theme of human history that we know to the ancient world. It's a condition of life that we have to live with. If you overtax someone, they're going to look for ways to get around it. They're going to look for ways, whether that's taking advantage of legal mechanisms that are in place, or as we saw in some of the European countries that did attempt to enact wealth taxation and really highly progressive tax systems, what happened? All the wealthy people left. They moved to other countries. And we can do one of two things in assessing that situation. One, we can pretend it doesn't exist and proceed with utopia. Two, we can recognize that human beings do respond to incentives. And they will tolerate a certain level of taxation as a necessary price to operate a government, as a necessary price to meet the revenue needs of that government. But they'll only tolerate it up to a point, and they'll only tolerate it insofar as they perceive it as fair.
Today, Americans once again stand at a crossroads, facing important decisions about just how much government we want, how much we're willing to pay, and who among us will foot the bill. President Biden says he'll raise taxes only on the rich, but every form of taxation takes money out of private hands and transfers important decisions from individuals to the state. We started this series by looking at the founders' belief in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and their belief that government's main purpose is to protect its citizens' rights to find them. Do Americans still view government this way? And if the government goes too far, if it reaches too significantly into our lives, too deeply into our pocketbooks, how will American taxpayers respond? Thanks for watching. And if you haven't already seen my other Unauthorized History series, check out the Unauthorized History of Socialism, also on Fox Nation. Until next time, I'm Bret Baier.